International Network of Theravada Studies seminar series, our final talk. We will, so obviously the rainy season about to start again, so it's the end of this series, and we will be in touch shortly with events that we're planning for the rainy season itself, which starts in a couple of weeks. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Tony Scott. And he is talking to us from the Rocky Mountains. So that backdrop, which I thought was one of those photos you can pin up behind you when on Teams, is actually for real. That's really great. It's extremely early in the morning there. So thank you very much, Tony, for joining us. I really thought you were a very early riser, because you were joining us for other seminars and things before, but then I found out you were doing that from Tokyo, and the time difference was on your side then. So thank you very much for joining us so early. So I think I first met you when I had the pleasure of giving a couple of lectures at the University of Toronto. And because that's where you've been doing your PhD research and also teaching, alongside obviously your visiting scholarship at Tokyo. And since then, I've got to know you as a regular participant, both in these talks and in Alish's Wednesday classes of advanced Pali grammar, reading through the Sudhaniti. What's always struck me about Tony is his energy, his expertise, and his penchant for asking far-reaching questions in a very simple, innocent way. It's really, and you think, oh, that's a simple question, and then when you look at it, actually, he's really putting his finger on some really interesting research issues. So he brings to his work a penchant for obviously very far-reaching questions, and also significant language expertise in Pali, Sanskrit, and Burmese, and now added Japanese to his string of languages, and also a clarity of expression, which I think must relate to his experience, his pre-academic experience as an educator at a museum of paleontology in Canada. So the University of Toronto is now benefiting from that expertise as an educator. So he's teaching for them alongside doing his PhD. He's in the final stages of his PhD. And it's on the Milindapañha and commentaries, and it brings together usually quite disparate areas. So both the textual analysis and editing, but also expertise in Vipassana meditation and in political and colonial history. And alongside all this dynamic international approach, he has an expertise that for me marks him out as very Canadian, which is ice hockey. So if you have any ice hockey questions, I'm sure you can ask at the end. So with the questions, the session's being recorded. So when it comes to the questions section at the end, so Tony will talk for 30-35 minutes. Then if you're happy to be recorded, just raise your hand and you'll be invited to speak. Or you can put your question in the chat, and P will be chairing that. Will take your question from the chat. So over now to Tony, who's talking to us on the Milindapañha and the 5th and 6th councils in Myanmar. Tony, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kate, for that generous introduction. And it's a real honor and pleasure to be presenting today, partly because I love the series and have been a close follower. And I also really appreciate the work that's being done at the Shan State Buddhist University by Venerable Kamasamy and P and everybody else. And a real admirer of King's College London. Never have been there, but hopefully one day. And I think it's just great what you're doing, making these freely available, the class with Alesh and everything that's going on there. So I'm a big supporter. I'm also very honored to present to some monastics who have joined us today, any monks and nuns in the audience. If I make any mistakes or anything like that, please do let me know. As Kate was saying, this is kind of this presentation, the Milindapañha and the 5th and 6th councils in Myanmar. The first half will be a project that I'm hoping to publish separately one day. And the second half does focus a little bit more on my dissertation. My dissertation is actually on the Milindapañha Atakata of the Mula Mingun Zerun Sayadaw. I won't talk too much about him today. Hopefully give you some teasers so that you'll come to other talks that I given the future. And I've spoken quite a bit about him in other venues, so it'll just be a little bit of a minor point. So what I plan to do today is talk a little bit about how the status of the Milindapañha has been negotiated. And so some of you may know it's a little bit of a kind of a liminal text, or an ambiguous text, in the sense that it's considered canonical in Myanmar alone, actually, and in other Theravada countries it's esteemed, it's elevated, it has a very important role, but it's not necessarily considered part of the Sutta Pitaka. And so I want to talk about how that status has been negotiated, but also the role of the Milindapañha in South and Southeast Asia over about maybe the last century and a half. It's such an interesting text. It's really all things to all people in some respects. And I think it's very informative to trace the history of a text and to look at how that text has been used and adapted and manipulated, dare I say. And it also gives us a sense of how a more formalized, exclusive canon has been developed over the last 2 centuries, at least, in the Tipitaka coming into what we would call a Pali canon. And so I hope to touch upon all of those. There's a lot of material to cover, so if I don't cover everything, please ask during the question period, and of course I'm happy to talk about any ice hockey as well. So the Milindapañha is an interesting text because it was one of the very first translated fully into any European language in 1890 by T.W. Rhys Davis. We also see it being translated into other European languages, so in German, Jnana Tiloka, in 1919, 1924. We also see it in French by Finot in 1923. Italian, I believe, in the same year. Then we see it being translated into Devanagari. And so that was in 1937 into Hindi, I should say, part of the kind of Buddhist revival that you see in that country. Of course, translated into Japanese from the Pali. There is a Chinese version. I won't be talking about the Chinese version, but the Pali version translated into Japanese in 1939 and 1940. So the picture I'm showing here is actually a later copy. Couldn't find a picture of the earlier one. We see it being translated into Russian in 1999. And then in 1997, the Pali was translated into Chinese by W. Pachau. And so I'm not saying it's the text that's been translated into the most amount of languages, but it certainly was an important early text in terms of translation, and it's really been making the rounds. I also understand maybe our own Alesh is currently translating into Spanish, and I have heard from a little bird that it's being retranslated into English. That'll be its at least third full time. So hopefully that will bring a lot of benefit to everybody. Now, I'm not actually interested in that, because at around the same time, in the translation in the European languages, because around the same time, we see it being translated into many vernaculars in South and Southeast Asia. So of course, the Pali version, we could do manuscript study. That's not exactly my focus. There is a colleague of mine in Thailand, a Malaysian man, and he's doing some amazing work on that. But we do see it being translated into various vernacular, into different forms throughout South and Southeast Asia. So that's what I'm a little bit more interested in today. Not so much the modern stuff, but what has happened in the past. And so my story actually starts, now you could pick many points at which to locate the history of the Milindapañha as a text, but one of the earliest accounts I have of it having a role or an impact in society, or at least the way that it's being used, comes from Thailand. And so here we have a picture of Kambunag, who was the foreign minister under King Mongkut, and a really important figure in kind of the modernization of Buddhism in that country. And in 1863, there was an interesting meeting where I believe a German, Adolf Bastian, and an American man came to the court of the king and wanted to discuss a little bit about the Pali Canon and the veracity or the truth of the Pali Canon. And so here's a picture of Adolf Bastian. He's an important figure because I believe he was a pioneer of ethnography in Germany. and wrote about this experience. I'm actually taking it from a French book that I showed you the source at the bottom here. This dialogue that happened between these Europeans at the court of the Thai king. So I've given you the French here. I'll give you the translations. But Adolphe Bastien asked the host, Kambunag, about the King Milinda, whose name is attached to a famous book. So this is 1863, almost 30 years before the translation into English by Rhys Davis. So it shows you this was an important book Europeans were taking note of. And on the subject of Nagasena, he wanted to know a little bit about the kind of marvels or the wonders that were surrounding Nagasena. And he wanted to know what Kambunag thought about this. And so the Thai foreign minister, he found one of his books that this character was said to be descended from the sky of Brahma. And for any of you who are familiar with the root, and so I haven't gone, I'm not going to touch on the root too much. That's not the topic of the talk today. And I think some of you are fairly familiar with it. But there is a scene where Nagasena, who is the kind of protagonist taking the questions from King Milinda, he is said to be a god in Brahma realm, Mahasena, and he is beseeched, or he is begged to come down to earth in order to meet Milinda in debate and essentially save the Buddhasasana. And so that's and in this framing story of King Nagasena, of the monk Nagasena, there's a lot of marvels and wonders, and one of which is he's a god, he comes reborn down onto earth. Now, the Europeans questioned Kambunag about the veracity, the truth of this claim, and Kambunag replies that actually this is a fable, which only means that all men have Brahmins for ancestors. So he is metaphorically interpreting what we see in the Milindapañha as an allegory. So it's at this point in 1863 when you have the Thai state trying to modernize. You also have colonial powers encroaching. They have been for a while, encroaching in Southeast Asia. The rationalist scientific modern view starting to challenge some of the earlier notions set forth by Buddhism. And so the actual status of the Milindapañha maybe is not being challenged, but it's being reinterpreted in a way that fits in with this worldview. Now that's important because Kambunag actually wrote a book in 1867. And in that he is reinterpreting another important book of Thai cosmology, which is the Tribhumi. And so there are three world systems. And in this reinterpretation, he tries to explain the kind of view of nature, weather, natural disasters, what have you, in a scientific, or at least towards a scientific way. And he's somewhat abandoning, or at least reinterpreting, the traditional Buddhist cosmology of it. And so we see the Milindapañha as an important step in Kambunag's general kind of modernization of Buddhism. And actually, the Milindapañha is one of the source materials for the Tribhumi, and that's why it's an important role here in Thailand. One thing I should note, though, is that Kambunag, while he challenges the kind of cosmological view of the Tribhumi and traditional Buddhist views on the matter, he is actually maintaining the ethical and religious value of the text. And so he's not completely throwing it out, but he, as we see in Thai history, is trying to make it a little bit more accommodating to his European visitors. So that's in Thailand. Now, let's go to Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, the Milindapañha also has a very interesting role, because what we see is that it was somewhat central to the Christian-Buddhist debates that were happening in the mid-19th century. And so I'm showing you here a picture of the Pandura Vadaya, which is the one of the most important of a series of Christian debates. And it was actually, so you have the monk Gunananda, who was the main player in this debate. And so that was in 1873. In 1877 and 1878, Gunananda was actually the editor of the first full publication of the Milindapañha, the Milinda Prashnaya, into Sinhalese. Now, the actual text had been translated about a century earlier by a disciple of Saranakara, who Anne Blackbird writes about. But the text itself was not published on a printing press until about a century later. And Malala Sekara talks about how this was at the time the most voluminous and probably the most important text produced by these Sinhalese controlled printing presses as a way to counter some of the Christian debate and some of the Christian kind of accusations against Buddhism. And he actually makes the case that it really initiated or was an important part of the Buddhist Renaissance in Sri Lanka. So well, in Thailand, we see it actually being kind of reinterpreted. In Sri Lanka at around the same time, we see it reinforced as an important intellectual tool to have a debate or a dialogue with the West and Christian missionaries. Now brings us to Myanmar. And I think this is a really interesting story that I'd like to tell. I'll try to, I mean, I could go on, I could give a whole talk about this particular anecdote, but we have the really enigmatic monk Ashin Adichavamsa. And one of Kate's students, Ashin Janika, has written an excellent dissertation on this. I really love this dissertation. You know, it's probably the only dissertation I've read from front to back. There's also a dissertation that's a master's student has done in Thailand about this particular figure as well. And he was an enigmatic monk in the sense that he was an Anglophone, a polyglot, was, you know, learning Hindi and apparently even learned some Japanese, spent, I think, about a decade in England, spent a great deal of time in India as well, engaging in all sorts of kind of intellectual debates with pundits there. And he was not afraid to reform Buddhism back home. He advocated vegetarianism, allowed lay people to wear shoes into his monastery. So he's just a fascinating figure. He's really a dissertation waiting to happen, quite frankly. And he wrote a Milinda Nisaya, published in 1916. And I won't get it too much into that, but I believe it's the only one that I can currently find in print in Myanmar. And so there's several Milinda Nisaya bitexts that date back centuries that you can find in manuscript form. But his Milinda Nisaya seems to be kind of the premier one that we have today. Now, so what's interesting is that around 1910, before he went to England, before he went to India, he became quite obsessed with the Milindapañha. And he somewhat, you could say, cast acquisitive eyes on the Milindapañha and just thought it was perfect. And I actually have a quote here that I've taken from his Atupeti, which is his biography. I believe it's published in 1965. Here's the 2017 edition. I can make this available if you email me. And he says, in terms of the questions that King Milinda, now this is not his actual word, this is his biographer writing about him. In terms of the questions that King Milinda submitted to Nagasena, rather than simply being just lofty, they are ideas with logical thinking and novelties, consisting of many innovations. If one also looks at the answers of Shin Nagasena, they too are ideas that penetrate not just the ideas of the Greek Abhidhamma, but are also teeming with many innovations. And so I thought this was fascinating. You know, I haven't actually been able to check this translation with someone more proficient in Burmese. So by all means, point out if I have any errors here, but I believe he's referring to the Greek Abhidhamma. And again, Ashin Adichavamsa was quite familiar with Western scholarship, most likely. He had a kind of cosmopolitan view of things. And so the Milindapañha was very fascinating for him because of the fact that it had these new ideas brought into Buddhism that were then kind of incorporated and smoothed out. And if anyone who studies the Milindapañha closely would kind of realize there are actually a lot of kind of non-Theravada ideas, or you could say ideas that are foreign to the Theravada, but are then incorporated into the Theravada. That's also why you find it in the dictionary so often, because it has a lot of terms that you won't find elsewhere in the Pali Canon. And so I'm thinking Ashin Adichavamsa, he was familiar with this, and he was really fascinated with the way that the Milindapañha is bringing together these two different ideas. Now, he's so fascinated that he actually came to live with the Manlay Sayadaw. And the Manlay Sayadaw, I'll talk a little bit about him in a moment, but he offered to the Manlay Sayadaw 300 questions in order to compile a treatise with new perspectives that might be reasonable and acceptable to the world and also be beneficial for the Sasana. And he hoped to actually name this the Adichavamsa Panha. So he actually had very lofty aspirations in this sense. He wanted to create a new generation Adichavamsa Panha, and he wanted to have this dialogue with one of the foremost scholars of the day, the Manlay Sayadaw. Unfortunately, the Manlay Sayadaw did not assent to these 300 questions. I'm not exactly sure why. I'm thinking partly because you have this very junior monk. He's kind of an up-and-comer. That's also a very, again, to recreate the Milindapañha, that's a very lofty aspiration. But I mean, I think there's a whole, if anyone can find these 300 questions or any drafts or anything like that, I mean, I think that would be absolutely amazing. It's unfortunate for us that the Adichavamsa never came to fruition. Now, why did he ask the Manlay Sayadaw? Well, I think this is a really important question that I don't have a total answer to, but one is that of his scholarly prowess. And so he wrote 2 books. One you see on the left, a discourse on the investigation of wisdom, and then the other one, a composition on Magadevi. The one on the right is in a sense a Niti text. I mean, it's a masterpiece, and it doesn't just focus on Buddhism. It focuses on poetry, kind of military science, politics, governing. But it would take such a masterful control of all the scholarship at that time to produce this, and so it's really an amazing work. Now, the Discourse on the Investigation of Wisdom is actually a compilation, I believe, about 9 volumes, and that is a series of question and answer that the Manlay Sayadaw had with the likes of Ledi Sayadaw and other important monastics at his time. And so I believe Ashin Adichavamsa, he saw this figure who's having these kind of debates with other leading monastic figures, and he wanted to be a part of that and make his own Adichavamsa Panha. So in a sense, the Discourse on the Investigation of Wisdom is, you could say, maybe a modern-day Milindapañha. The other thing I'll say, too, is that the Manlay Sayadaw adjudicated many kind of Vinichaya or kind of monastic judgment cases. And one in particular was a story about drilling into a temple to have the wiring for electric lights. And Manlay Sayadaw, this caused a big controversy. Manlay Sayadaw eventually said, yes, it's okay to drill into the temple to provide electricity, electrical lights for this temple. And so in a sense, he's on the side of, I don't want to say he's on the side of modernity, but he is trying to reconcile Theravada Buddhism, as he understands it, with some of the new horizons that are being brought by technology and by other factors, especially by colonial powers. And so I think Adichavamsa wanted to do something very similar, where he wanted to actually update Buddhism or modernize Buddhism in a sense, and he wanted to use the Milindapañha as a vehicle for that. And I'm sure that's not the first time in history. And these 3 cases, they're limited in the sense that I'm only going back to, the mid-19th century. Part of this project is I'm trying to look for more cases like this. We also have similar things happening in Cambodia, to a lesser extent in Laos. But I think this idea of the Milindapañha being used as a vehicle for reform is a constant one throughout its history. And we can probably see it reinventing itself time and time again. And it really lends itself to that as well. So we're sticking again with Myanmar. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about another book by Ashin Adichavamsa. And he's just such a fascinating character. And this is his Bhikkhuni Sasanopadesa. And I do have a copy of this, so a digital copy. So if you did need it, you can by all means email me. And it was a controversial book published in 1934. And it advocates for the full ordination of women as nuns in Myanmar and gives a series of kind of examples or how this can be done. So kind of instructions on how this can be done. And it caused, monastic censorship of Ashin Adichavamsa and quite an uproar at the time. Now, why am I pointing out this book? Well, as this table of contents illustrates here, and this is just 1 or 2 examples, he makes a great deal of use of the Milindapañha. And I'd actually even go so far as to say the Milindapañha might be his main kind of textual source for making this argument. And part of that has to do with not necessarily direct references to female monastics, to nuns, but the idea of the length of the sasana and the different stages of the sasana. So that's a debate, a question we won't get into too much here because that will take us too far afield. But the idea of at what stage is enlightenment possible in the Buddhist sasana, and at what stage are nuns supposed to have disappeared, and how long will the sasana last relative, because of the full ordination of women by the Buddha. These are all questions that are addressed in the Milindapañha, or at least there's a ground to address them. Now, Ashin Adichavamsa makes great use of this text. And I was really surprised because I didn't have this text till about a year ago. And as I got into it, I thought, Milindapañha is everywhere here. And so that was really exciting for me. And it shows you how this text is being used, again, to make these reforms, or to make kind of, I don't want to say novel arguments, but for people to make the case to somewhat modernize Buddhism, or at least change it in their way. Because there's a little bit, I hesitate to use the word reform because there's also kind of a conservative tendency here as well. And so I don't want to say progressive, but the Milindapañha is the vehicle for change. Now, this is related, again, to the topic of my dissertation, which is the Milindapañha Atthakatha of the Mulaminggun Jetavana Sayadaw. Now, he was essentially a contemporary of Ashin Adichavamsa, one of the pioneers of modern Vipassana. I don't want to make him the pioneer, but he's a very important early figure for the kind of modern Burmese meditation that we see arising in the first part of the 20th century. And I would argue a little bit earlier too, but really coming into fruition with the Mulaminggun Jetavana Sayadaw. And he wrote the Milindapañha Atthakatha, published it in 1948. I think he waited about 12 years until he published it for World War II to die down, and for the right political climate as well, I would argue. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because he is also using it's an amazing text. It's about 400 pages, all told, and it covers so many topics, just as the root text does, right? The root text is really encyclopedic in that sense. But one of the controversial topics that's discussed here, again, is female ordination. And I do know that I don't have evidence that the Mulaminggun Jetavana Sayadaw met Ashin Adichavamsa, but I know that they were connected through a mutual disciple who is Umyat Ja, who was a monk disrobed, became a very important lay purveyor of Vipassana Buddhism, especially in the Shan state. Again, I'm not sure if this is one of your students, Kate, but Jyotika, librarian, I believe, either at SOAS or King's College London, wrote another excellent dissertation where he talks about Umyat Ja, not just, but talks about Umyat Ja's role in spreading Vipassana and Shan communities. And so, again, we see some of the same arguments being used, and the same question in the root text of the Milindapañha being used as a platform to discuss some of these changes or these proposed reforms to Buddhism. I do have evidence, I should say, of Ashin Adichavamsa referencing the Mulaminggun Jetavana Sayadaw as an inspiration for his 1934 discussion on bhikkhuni ordination, and that's before the Milindapañha Atthakatha was ever published. And so I think these ideas were circulating within the monastic community for quite some time before they were put to print. And so, again, I could talk all day about this particular text because it's the topic of my dissertation, but all I want to say is that a great deal of controversy erupted over it in the newspapers and print, as far up as the Sixth Council, and you see how the Milindapañha, because of its kind of ambiguous status, and because of its, in a sense, open-endedness, and the way that the question-answer format allows interpretation in multiple directions, it's being used as a vehicle for reform, and it's also kind of causing controversy or stirring up things a little bit in the monastic and lay Buddhist community as well. So why is this possible? Like, how is this possible, especially in Myanmar, that the Milindapañha is thrust to the center of all these different, dare I say, controversies, or at least becomes a very charged tool for change? Well, that brings us to the Fifth Council. And again, the title of my talk is about the Fifth and Sixth Councils. I think to understand the importance of the Fifth and Sixth Councils, we needed to look at all these different cases and how the status of the Milindapañha becomes changed in the Fifth Council and why that is important for its role that it plays in society at large. Now, the Fifth Council, 1871, it started many times before King Mindon. I mean, I didn't start many times before, but like the Sixth Council, the process leading up to it was very drawn out. There were several rounds of editing. Everything was really kind of premeditated in the sense that the actual council and the recitation was more of a performance rather than where they're doing the actual strict editing work. But it was a very important point in Buddhist history, in Myanmar especially, because it's the point at which we see the what I call the Tipitaka, which is I use that term in the sense of a more open, kind of localized set of loose texts. Peter Skilling talks about how in Thailand, for instance, 200 years ago, the Tipitaka would also include grammatical texts, which we certainly wouldn't include in that today. But there were a lot of texts that were a little bit more free-floating, and the borders of the text, although they were authoritative, they were a lot more porous. And so a movement back and forth. But that starts to change with this Fifth Council. And I'm not saying that this is the first time in history where the canon is becoming closed and becoming made into an exclusive canon, but this is one of the inflection points in history that we have a lot of information about. So the Fifth Council is important because the Tipitaka is becoming a canon. It's becoming closed. It's becoming exclusive, and it's now having the kind of authority of the state where it's these texts belong and these texts don't. Now, the Milindapañha became part of this exclusive canon. And in fact, it became really the last part. These are pictures of the stele at the Kutaga Pagoda, provided to me by the Kutaga Pagoda Project. So I'm very grateful for these pictures. And we had a wonderful talk on this topic by Mark Allen. I believe that was maybe about 7 or 8 months ago. And so some great work being done on that front. This is the ones on the left is the first. The one on the right is the last slab to be installed. Now, judging by the dates, I believe they're about the last to be installed. Maybe not exactly the last. And Chris Clark has been communicating with. I've been corresponding a little bit with him. And so I don't think the Milindapañha was exactly the last, but it was very close to being one of the last installed. And this is a little bit of a mystery to me, how exactly the Milindapañha got into the canon at this point. And the reason I say that is because for this research, I really rely a lot on Myanmar dissertations. And I've only been to the University of Mandalay and University of Yangon to acquire these dissertations, but they're just amazing resources. And I'm so grateful to the scholars. Here's two particular dissertations that really shed a lot of light on this topic, on this subject. And essentially what they say is that U Jagara, who became the first Shwegan Sayadaw, he was convening these, he was one of the conveners, I should say, of the Fifth Council, and he was charged with editing the texts, particularly the Neti Pakarana and the Petikopadesa. So those are kind of the last third and the second last text to be part of the canon. But there's no mention in either of these dissertations about who edited the Milindapañha. So exhaustive list of everyone who edited what, but no mention of the Milindapañha. Now that might just be, I have to look at the sources that these two dissertations used. But I think, it seems like there was something kind of uncertain going about the status of the Milindapañha. So if you look at the commentaries, the Kudaka Nikaya, which is the last part of the Sutta Pitaka, it has 15 members. Whereas if we look at the de facto Fifth Council list of the Kudaka Nikaya, it has the Netipakarana, the Petikopadesa, and then coming in last is the Milindapañha. So it like barely snuck in to the canon. Now, how exactly was it decided that the Milindapañha should join part of the Khuddaka Nikaya? I still don't have a definite answer to that. I think one answer has to do with the Milindapañha was there. People were using it. We have manuscripts that, it's in our manuscript collections, at least as far back as the mid-18th century. And so I think part of it was we have to account for the fact that the Milindapañha is here, even though it was not mentioned in the commentaries. And Buddhaghosa, it was mentioned, but not as part of the Khuddaka Nikaya, right? But you have to justify that. And so there has been some kind of creative justification that we see going on. And this is not directly connected to the Fifth Council, but here we see a text from Jnana-Bhivamsa. Sorry, I don't think my poly didn't kind of come through there, so that's a little bit weird. But he was one of the very important monk, kind of a part of these Chindwind monastics who are really bringing scholarship to the monastic court, becoming Sangarajas, so to speak, of the kings at that time. And what he says, now this was actually brought out by Peter Jackson in the Journal of the Polytextite. It's only like 2 pages or something, but wonderful translation. And what happens is that Jnana-Bhivamsa is trying to say, well, why is the Netipakarana and the Petikopadesa not mentioned by Buddhaghosa, essentially? And he says, well, the Charya Pitaka and the Buddhavamsa are not mentioned, are not taken because they go under the Jataka, and the Neti and the Petikopadesa and so on, Adi, because they go under the Nidesa and or the Patisambhidamaga. And so what we see here is in about 221 years ago, around 1800, Jnana-Bhivamsa is trying to say, we have these texts, Netipakarana, Petikopadesa, they're not mentioned by Buddhaghosa, but how do we account for their important position? Well, actually, they're subsumed under these headings. And so they were always there, they just weren't singled out as being part of their own. And we can talk about that. The Jataka especially what seemed like a placeholder for many different texts, not just what we consider Jataka today. But I think this is a really creative way Jnana-Bhivamsa shows us how these people were trying to negotiate the status of certain texts that are important to their concept of the Tipitaka, but were not mentioned in the commentaries. And the one thing that I think is really important is pointing out the idea of the Adi here when it's the Petikopadesa Adi, Neti Petikopadesa Adi. And so what I'm trying to say is that, well, perhaps the so on and the so forth actually included the Milindapañha and maybe the compilers of the Fifth Council, because obviously this text, the Abhinavatika, is an important text that the compilers of the Fifth Council would have been aware of. Perhaps they're kind of smuggling in the Milindapañha after under either the Patisambhidamaga or the Nidesa. So again, it shows us a little bit about how the status is negotiated. So what about the Milindapañha Atakata of the Mingun Jetavana Sayadaw? Now, he is also trying to negotiate the status of the text because it's been included in the Fifth Council. It doesn't have a Pali commentary. It has Pali sub-commentaries, so I don't want to misspeak here, but it doesn't have an Atakata in the same way that we see the Digha Nikaya Atakata or something like that. And so he actually links it to the Fourth Council in Sri Lanka. And so he's saying that the text was brought down through the lineage of Milinda, and then it was essentially brought into the council or made into a book in the Fourth Council. So that's his argument in his actual text. What's interesting, though, is that this disagrees with what the members of the Sixth Council say. So to kind of close my talk here, I know I'm a little bit over time, so I'll try to wrap this up within the next 5 minutes. But we see the Fifth Council, 1954, 1956. I know it kind of lasted a little bit longer than that, but here's where we see the kind of pageantry part of it. And in the Fifth Council, or part of the Sixth Council, they were producing a dictionary. And the dictionary actually was an important part of the Sixth Council from the very early planning stages. I don't think it was published until a few years later afterwards, but the 24-volume dictionary is still not completed, probably the best Pali dictionary in the world. This was an important part of the Sixth Council, an important part of making this exclusive canon. It literally says at the beginning of the dictionaries, this is an attempt to seal the Pali canon. Because if you want to have closed Pali canon, you have to have kind of rules of what belongs and what doesn't, and you kind of police those rules using something like a dictionary. And so in the dictionary, this is the Nidana of the dictionary. So in the first volume, so the introduction, they actually discuss the Netipakarana, Petikopadesa, and the Milindapañha. And the compilers of the Nidana say that Ashin Nagasena and King Milinda are extraordinary people. They appeared more than 5 years after the exalted Buddha. And they actually say that it emerged after the Fourth Council in Sri Lanka. And so they're actually contradicting the Mula Mingun Jitavana Seda, and they're saying, no, it emerged after this time. So they first of all recognize was not part of the time of the Buddha. It came much, much after. Well, then how exactly do they make sense of this? And how do they justify including it in the canon? Well, they say, although it emerged in a later period, the Milindapañha is a text that explains the concerns that seem like difficult irregularities on the surface according to the wish of the Buddha. And so, first of all, it's in line with the Buddha's teachings. And then the second thing they say is that Buddhaghosa cites the Milindapañha to give the solution in the places where there's an urgent explanation needed. And so in his commentaries, Buddhaghosa is citing this. And then after the time of the Milindapañha, the text fit to be acknowledged as Pali truly did not emerge. And so what they're basically saying is that the Milindapañha was the last real Pali text. And after that point, we have texts that are written in Pali, but they're not part of the canon. They're not part of the exclusive canon that has been created. And so they're really saying the Milindapañha is the border. It's where the Pali begins and ends. And in Ashin Adichavamsa's words, it's the brick wall. Now, again, I don't know if this is exactly his words or his biographer, but I see this metaphor of the Pali brick wall in a few different sources. So the Milindapañha is the brick wall. It's what kind of keeps the rest of the canon together and in, and it's what keeps everything else out. And so it has this really important function, and not for everybody. And so, of course, I'm going to end with a little bit of controversy. Really fascinating episode in the fifth session of the Sixth Council. This is the Sri Lankan session. This was the last one, April 23rd, May 24th, 1956. And what happens is you have the Sri Lankan delegation and the Thai delegation and the Myanmar delegation, others, getting together, and they're supposed to recite the Jataka, the Netipakarana, Petikopadesa, and the Milindapañha. Reciting the Jataka, no problem. Then when they get to the Netipakarana, Petikopadesa, and the Milindapañha, the last three texts of the Khuddaka Nikaya, the Sri Lankan and the Thai delegation throw up their hands and they say, no way, we are not reciting this. If you include especially the Petikopadesa and especially the Milindapañha into the Khuddaka Nikaya, then we're going right back to Sri Lanka or Thailand and we're holding the Seventh Buddhist Council because these texts do not belong. Okay, interesting. What's even more interesting is that the Mahasi Sayadaw and the Mingun Sayadaw agreed. And actually, the Mingun Sayadaw, after everyone kind of broke, came back after consultations. He had a 14-point kind of write-up about why the Milindapañha should not be included in the Khuddaka Nikaya. And I think I know where this 14-point can be found. And in fact, the dissertation that I cite below mentions that it probably can be found in the Mingun kind of museum library. Haven't been able to go there. If anybody else can get there, go for it. I mean, I think this would be an amazing paper to know what these 14 points were. But eventually they were overruled by the Nyanyang Sayadaw. So he was the convener of the Sixth Council. He passed away before the Sri Lankan Fifth Council began, but he actually created kind of what is called the Sangyana Ime Epue, the question and answers of the council. And in that, he talks about how it talks for the justifications for including all the different texts, especially these contentious texts. And so essentially, posthumously, Nyang Sayadaw, his argument wins the day. And in all the documents, this issue is quietly settled. But one could imagine that it was not so quietly settled. And I think there's a lot of research still to be done here. But what it shows you is that the status of the Milindapañha as part of the exclusive canon is still debated today. And because of the ambiguous status of the Milindapañha, and because of its kind of open-ended and special nature, characterized by the questions, by some non-Theravada orthodoxy, it is a very poor, in my argument, it's a very poor brick wall for the exclusive canon. Because in the process of trying to create an exclusive canon, and by putting the poly brick wall of the Milindapañha there, you're actually making it more, I don't want to use the term vulnerable, because I think we want to get away from the rhetoric of like challenging the canon or what have you. But because the Milindapañha doesn't have a commentary, then the Mingun Zedun Sayadaw writes a commentary, and now he is kind of smuggling that into the canon. He's bringing his own views into the exclusive canon. And then you could see people in the future writing a different Atthakatha on the Milindapañha, or now we're going to maybe have another Tika, so forth and so forth and what have you. And so my point here is that the exclusive, and this is how I'd like to finish, the exclusive canon is always a little bit of a fiction, and it's shored up or reinforced by councils, by kings, and then over time it breaks down again. And by looking at the history of the Milindapañha and its inflection point of reform, how it's a vehicle reform, we can actually see, and we can even envision, how the exclusive canon will eventually revert back to a more open Tipitaka. So everyone, thank you for your time. Sorry I've spoken a little bit too long today, but I really appreciate the chance to talk, and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Tony, for such a wonderful talk. I've learned so much from your talk, and I've been thinking when you were explaining about the status of Milindapañha. One of the things is that it's quite. If we look at the kind of curriculum of monastic education in Myanmar, and that's quite strange because Milindapañha is so pervasive, like you said, but they are not examined on, or it's not included in their curriculum as it were. But still, it's very popular. It's very as you have shown here, very interestingly kind of. Plays a very interesting role in changing various dynamics within that kind of Theravada context and so forth, and also not just in the kind of reinterpretation or interpretation of Buddhism, but also how one thinks about Theravada and canon and so forth. So that's what I wanted to say. Have you any thoughts about why it's not included in curriculum? I think this is my first question, and then I will open it up to others.
Well, one thing I will say now, I really like to look more at Venerable Kamasami's work on this, and I thought I maybe saw that it was included in some upper Dhammacharya exams, but I could be wrong on that. But I think, in a way of kind of answering this, what I'll say is the Milinda Nisaya by the Ashin Adichavamsa was very important for the exams. And even though it's the Milindapañha, I think at one point was kind of included in some exams around this time in the first part of the 20th century. And so at least his biography says people praised the Milinda Nisaya for being a good resource for students. On the flip side, that was a major reason why people didn't like the Milindapañha Atthakatha of the Mula Mingun Zedun Sayadaw, because, and I have this newspaper article, and it's just so fascinating because it says there's a lot of mistakes in the Pali, and there's some interpretations that we don't believe, and this particular text could possibly corrupt exam takers. And so that's one of the reasons why they say we don't want it in the sasana. But I think part of what, and then another way now this is an area I think really would be a lot of interesting for research, because the Neti Pakarana seems an important part of exams. And it actually seems like it becomes a little bit of a method, right? And I should note to everybody that the Mula Mingun Zedun Sayada wrote a commentary on the Petikopadesa, the sister text of the Neti Pakarana. So that was part of the exams, and that's always, I think, been like a methodology in itself.
Yes,
you can even call it a type of Theravada logic. Whereas the Milindapañha is funny because it stands not only at the border of the so-called exclusive canon, but it's somewhat on the border of Theravada Buddhism. It does have some concepts in there that don't belong to kind of standard Theravada. Now, they've been adopted, they've been kind of glossed over, but some not so. So if you really do take the Milindapañha literally, you're going to get into some trouble with Theravada orthodoxy, because you're going to say, well, you know, how, for instance, there's certain ideas about like nibbana without remainder. And so there's some concepts that seem to be coming in from Mahayana or from some Sanskrit Buddhism. And so I think if you allow the Milindapañha to be fully kind of embraced, then you're shifting things even more and you're opening it up for further, I don't want to say necessarily innovation, but possibly even contradiction. So that's how I'd answer your question, and I really appreciate that wonderful question.
Okay. Great, thank you. So now let's have questions from others. Are there any questions?
There's a question in the chat.
Ah, right. So the question is about the historical identity of King Milindapañha or Milinda, and there's a little bit, since there's a little bit of controversial surrounding historical identity. So.
Thank you very much for the question. And I actually wrote about this in a chapter in my dissertation. It took me like 4 months, wound up not using it in my dissertation at all, but really important for me to do the background research. And I have a kind of mentor at the University of Toronto. His name is Brian Levman, and he does a lot of great work in this regard. And I mean, his linguistic ability is really top notch. And so you almost have to be a linguist to answer this. But he puts forth the idea that, and we also see, I believe, Peter Skilling talking about this in terms of a reference to Milinda in a Sanskrit work by Vasubandhu, very fleeting reference, looking at the Tibet translation as well. And my sense is actually that you have two things happening here. One is you have Europeans getting very excited 150 years ago when they're like, oh, this is a Buddhist text talking about a Greek king or a Bactrian king. And so there's a lot of projection onto this. And that is why this text, I think, became so popular early on in Europe, especially because it was kind of connecting seemingly the different civilizations, so to speak. So I think there was a little bit of an over kind of reach in terms of, or maybe the evidence, an over-determination of the evidence that this was, in fact, Menander. And, oh, sorry? Oh, and so Brian Levman, my mentor at University of Toronto, he actually says that Milinda might even just be like the name of a general king. And he kind of looks at it linguistically to say that it was something maybe like the person who had a retinue or the commander of an army. And then over time, and now this could have happened much before Europeans too, we could have had early Buddhist communities that were making connection between the Milindapañha and Gandhara. And actually, I don't know if this is, I think this is okay for me to say because it's been published on the IAV's website, but Richard Solomon believes he has found a fragment that mentions Nagasena in the Gandhara material. And so there is this there is this connection with this kind of Greek Indo civilization and the Milindapañha, and I'm not discounting that, but certainly the text, I believe, was written without King Milinda or King Menander originally, and then it was projected back onto that this was this historical king. So almost certainly no historical conversation or debate took place. Now, this projection probably happened multiple times. Early Buddhist communities, again by Europeans, were doing it still. But I really think that one has to take this association between King Milinda in the text and King Menander at face value, and at the best, I believe, or sorry, I take it with a grain of salt, and at best, I believe it's just a literary device.
Tony, just want to thank you for the answer. Could you put in the links maybe towards at the end for those writings that you mentioned? That would be super helpful. Sorry to interrupt you there, P. I'll leave you to carry on.
No, and may I just ask, so that you mean Brian Ledman's piece and then Peter Skilling's piece?
Yes, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. We have a question from Kate and Sven. Perhaps Sven could go first. Can you?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tony, for the wonderful presentation. Actually, I had two questions which you have partly answered already. The first one is, some years ago, I was working with a major research project which dealt with religious encounters between Asia and Europe. And we wanted to make a source book on dialogues between different religions, dialoguing with each other. And somebody brought up the idea to include the Milindapañha here. And I was actually discouraging that because, as you have been saying, as far as I know the text, and I'm not an expert, I read the Jnana translation many years ago. But as far as I understand the text, Milinda is just a generic layperson, as they so often occur in Buddhist texts, asking very specific, very Buddhist questions and gets a specific answer then. But you know the text much better than I do. Is there anything in the text or in the questions of Milinda which we could interpret as there's a Greek philosophical context, or he is asking from Greek premises here? Yeah. Is there anything like that?
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful questions, Sven. And the first thing I'll say is that this goes back to P's question, why is the Milindapañha not included? Buddhaghosa does have a point in one of his commentaries where he says, what the king says, you can't make, you can't recite that. A monk cannot make, this is in the context of the Vinaya rule, a monk cannot make a layperson recite what the king says. And so the king, what the king's saying, not only is a generic kind of lay figure, but does not rise to the level of being kind of authoritative in the Tipitaka. Whereas what Nagasena says, you can make a layperson recite that, and not only that, but you actually what Nagasena says is a good example of the kind of the canon that's scattered, that's not collected into one text. And so what's also interesting about that is that there's many untraced quotations in the Milindapañha that seem to be coming from like some kind of Sanskrit or other Prakritic language that we don't have. And I think there's still maybe even like 20 or 30 that are untraced and references to certain other lay people that we don't have. So that's what makes it fascinating. Now, your second point, which is your larger point, is a really important point. And there is a great debate about this. And again, I think we have a little bit of an overdetermination of the evidence, where you have people like Johannes Bronkhorst to a lesser extent, but then a lot of scholars in the before him who actually say that the philosophy of the Milindapañha is influenced by Greek philosophers, and that we get the syllogistic structure especially in the second half of the book and in this area that's called Anumana Panha, like questions on inference. If you look at the inferential structure of those questions, it's like a first-year South Asian philosophy logic course, with like, there's a smoke on the hill, or sorry, yeah, there's smoke on the hill, and like in my kitchen, when there's fire, there's smoke, and so because of this kind of concomitant relationship, there must also be fire on the hill, and so you get a very similar kind of inferential structure in these especially in the second set of questions, and it's unlike anything we see in Pali literature up to that point, including the Katavatu. And the Katavatu has some of this same idea, but that doesn't quite go so far, especially with these analogies or these concomitant kind of relationships. And so very sophisticated logic at a very early point. And there's I believe he's a Polish man, and I can put this in the link too, and he just published an article last year, and he's a logician, so he's not a Buddhist studies scholar. And he has a very sophisticated analysis of this logical structure, and he says it's clearly coming from Greece. Now, another paper that I'm hoping to write, that I wrote for my dissertation, got out of it, and would like to look at it, I argue something different. I actually think that what we see is a proto kind of pramana. So these instruments of knowledge that you see that are very important in South Asian philosophy. I think we actually see a proto pramana coming in the Milindapañha, and that I don't think we need to reach to Greek sources to have this kind of philosophy. Now, I still have to make, this is still quite an argument, but I think we overemphasize the Greek origins, although Gandhara and that is important. But I think if you want to look at connections, it's more fruitful to look at the connections between the Milindapañha and like Nyaya logical systems, early kind of like the Nyaya Sutra. And not only that, but I think you have to put it in the whole context of like this philosophical debate. And there's a lot of interesting connections between the Milindapañha and some of the Upanishads, especially the Great Forest Upanishad, and I believe like Yajnavalkya. I'm not sure if I'm saying him, but he's an ascetic who is having debates with the king, and there's a lot of really interesting similarities there. So this Polish man, he does like what it calls universal logic. So he says, yes, this logical structure, very sophisticated, it's clearly coming from Greece. Bronkhorst has a little bit of a similar, but maybe less kind of philosophically oriented argument. Whereas myself and others, I believe that it's more fruitful to look at the Upanishads and then like the Nyaya Sutras and some of these like early points. So I think the Milindapañha probably maybe even influenced some of these later South Asian schools of philosophy. So in a roundabout way, that's my argument. Really important debate. And I think I see those volumes coming up by Brian Black too, and I'm always like, where's the Milindapañha in here?
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Kate?
Thank you. I wonder if I could first maybe ask Sven, if there were any outputs from that project on Encounter, that if you could send us the link or a bit of information about that in the chat, that would be absolutely amazing. Thanks. Tony, before I ask you my question about Milindapañha, just want to commiserate you on the Stanley Cup final, Tampa Bay taking it from the Canadian. That was terrible. Sorry about that. But back to the Milindapañha. Sorry. So I have so many questions, but I'll try and restrict it. So Milindapañha is, you say, this ambiguous status. So was it ever used in Vinaya? Was it ever used in these, either the sort of later ones, I don't think so, but all the earlier Vinaya as a source of authority on any particular point? Other question, Adichavamsa, is his work still authoritative in any area, and how did he use the Milindapañha to back up the idea of restarting the Bhikkhuni ordination?
Thank you again. Thank you for the wonderful question. The Vinaya question is, I think, a really important one, and this kind of gets at like an undercurrent of my argument that the Milindapañha is dangerous, because if you allow it to be a text that people can rely on, then they can really start arguing in different ways that maybe are against the orthodoxy. And so kind of goes back to P's question, why is it not really part of the curriculum? And that's why I think, in a way, I don't want to say they made a mistake by including in the Tipitaka, but they've really opened up a can of worms, if I can say that. So I don't know of any instances where it was used for that. Any Vinachayas. I don't have any examples, but I would really like to do a project on that and looking at those. And of course, the Mula Mingun Zedun Sayadaw does create his own Vinachayas, where he is using it as a really important source, and one he creates around it. I do also know that Nyang Sayadaw is writing his own series of, so he's the convener of the Sixth Council. He's writing a series of these judgment texts around the same time as the Mula Mingun Zedun Sayadaw is publishing his Milindapañha Atthakatha, actually after, and he's writing it not only about the bhikkhuni, but the katina, the robe giving ceremony, because that was the other controversial part of the Milindapañha Atthakatha. And it seems like he's actually writing against the Mula Mingun Zedun Sayadaw, and I've been told that they really were at loggerheads, and that was a big reason why the Milindapañha Atthakatha was definitely not part of the Sixth Council. And what's interesting is the English translation of the Petikopadesa, the editor, I forgets my name, I can't remember the name, he mentions how little the Sixth Council seems to use the Petikopadesa Atthakatha with the Mula Mingun Zedun Sayadaw wrote. So it seems like there was a direct kind of effort to exclude all of that from the Sixth Council going around with the Mula Mingun Zedun Sayadaw. And so I really don't know quite the answer to that. I think one interesting thing would be to look at the Milinda Tika, which is coming out of Thailand. And then there's the Milinda Gantipadi, I believe, and then Sankepa, which those two I really don't know much about. But it certainly does have a role in terms of grammar and Jataka, which were very important issues for, like, you know, a Thai monk writing 300-400 years ago. But I don't really know how much it has been used, but I would not doubt that sprinklings of it have been used, because we see it being referenced in the Pali commentary so often. So at least those parts can be used as kind of firm footing. Now, in terms of Ashin Adichavamsa, I did go to his monastery in Yangon 2 years ago. Seems a little bit run down as a way, and so I don't think his kind of legacy is really as strong as it used to be. I'm not sure if it was Ashin Janaka's dissertation or another, but he might have wrote like 400 different texts. So he was a very prolific writer, and I only have maybe about 30 or so or 20 or so that are downloaded. So my sense is no, he has fallen off the face of the earth a little bit, and we in this little kind of room might be a little bit more interested. But his arguments, I'm still going through the Burmese, but essentially what he's saying, now this is what's interesting, because he's also linking his arguments with the ability for a Vipassana meditator to kind of reach the highest goal of Buddhism. And so he's saying, and now this is again the sprinklings of the Burmese that I've been translating. He's saying that all of the commentators, or he has this really wonderful section in the Bhikkhuni Sasanopadesa, where he lists all the different schemes of the disappearance of the sasana, from Buddhaghosa to Nagasena to Ledi Sayadaw to his contemporaries. And I mean, that should be translated. Like, that is such like maybe about 50 or 80 pages. And so the idea is that it's still very possible for people to become enlightened, and that is especially true of women. And then what we see the Mula Mingun Zedun Sayadaw picking up on is, okay, and this is an argument I'm going to make in my dissertation, if you are able to be enlightened as a woman through Vipassana, but you don't have the means to be fully ordained, then you essentially have to die in 24 hours, which is what we also see in the Milindapañha. That's a Nagasena quote. And so the idea with Nagasena is the root question in the Milindapañha is, okay, the Buddha said that the sasana is only going to last, I can't remember the exact timing in Milindapañha, 2,500 years. But on the other hand, the Buddha said that as long as there are people following ethics and people following practice, then there'll always be arhants in the world. So Milinda says, Nagasena, which one is true? They can't both be true. And so this is this kind of dialectical question that allows the Ashin Adichavamsa and others to kind of blow open the issue and really explore it in multiple different directions. And so it has to do with the longevity of the sasana and what is and what is not possible. But what I found really interesting is that Ashin Adichavamsa, not associated with Vipassana, at least as far as I'm concerned, but he is using some of these Vipassana arguments to say there's still people practicing Vipassana out there. And so if we look at the Milindapañha, then it's still possible to be arhants. And so that's how I see it kind of all fitting in. The other point is I'll just say briefly, it's good for the sasana to have women ordained. And that will be another kind of step or a protection to ensure that the sasana will continue. So that's the other kind of argument that they're making. But I can't really answer your question because I have not yet translated that material. That's the hardest chapter. I'm kind of scared of it.
Thank you very much.
Oh, so there's a question. Ashin Adichavamsa, which language did he write in? So Pali or Burmese or a combination?
Thank you for the question. He wrote in both languages. His Milinda Nisaya is obviously is a bitext, so he's using both Burmese and Pali. And what's interesting, again, this is from his biographies, but some of the leading monks of his time, he was asked to produce the Milinda Nisaya, and then monks at his time just apparently, again, from his biography, really praised his ability in Pali. And so he was very good at Pali, and he and his kind of cohort or his contemporary Shin Ukata, I believe, which Ashin Janaka writes about in his dissertation, can't recommend that enough. They both had Sanskrit roots, and they were using kind of the a modern European comparative method. And so that's another reason why, and I have this in my chapter, I didn't mention it today, but Shin Ukata was an editor of the Sixth Council who eventually left because they didn't allow him to make any redactions, especially redactions from the Fifth Council. So in a sense, the Sixth Council was almost just an iteration of the Fifth Council. The Sixth Council was reinforcing what was done earlier. Now, I don't want to reduce it to just that, but so because of these modern kind of methods, Shin Ukata, I would almost say for sure, would not have wanted the Milindapañha in there, or would have gotten rid of quite a bit of it because he was trying to exercise material that he thought was influenced by Hinduism or what have you. So Ashin Adichavamsa was apparently very skilled in Pali and also had this Sanskrit background, which I don't believe the Mullah Mingun Zaidu and Sayadaw had, at least not a formal Sanskrit training in the same sense as Ashin Adichavamsa, because he spent a great deal of time in India. And I don't know if it was him or Shin Ukata who was said to have actually debated in Sanskrit with Indian pundits. And so, I mean, I just really can't stress enough, Ashin Adichavamsa, you get like 3 dissertations out of him. And I think his material really needs to be looked at carefully. And a whole team of people should need to do that.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. I agree with that, with your point. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other question? Perhaps. Alesh. Yes.
Yes. Hi, Tony. Thank you so much for this amazing lecture. As I'm translating the text, I learned a great deal. I have also many questions, but I think I will try to formulate a Milinda-style question.
Okay.
So on the one hand, it seems that the advocates for the canonicity of the Milinda, they raise the point that it's a rational text. It's full of logical arguments and rationality. Many of these monks, they had exposure to Western knowledge, and that we're talking mid-20th century already. So by that time, there was a great deal of knowledge also about the Chinese version of the Milinda. Mm. And it was pretty clear that the Pali version was not all of one piece. So my question would be, how did they resolve this contradiction? Because if you are a rationalist, and that's why you want to include the Milindapañha, but if you are a rationalist, that you also should accept that this text is not of one piece. It's actually a historical construction. So do they debate that, or it's something that never appears in the debates? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alesh. I'm really glad that you were able to make it, and I hope you're doing well. And I've been thinking a lot about you, because as you translate, you must face so many more kind of fine difficulties with looking at how to translate certain words. So I'd really be fascinated by some of the words that one encounters that don't seem to be properly Pali or what have you. And then, as you had mentioned, the Chinese version, which seems to be a lot more it's quite a bit shorter, and it's much more rudimentary in the sense that it almost at some points shows like not a very familiar understanding of Buddhism, or maybe it's more generous to say a different understanding of Buddhism that we see in China. But although you can compare them, and again, Brian Levman at University of Toronto has done some good work on this, where you can say that, yeah, they have like a core structure that's similar, and they seem to revolve around quite a bit of the same metaphors. But the answers to the questions in the Chinese Nagasena Sutra, Bhikshu Sutra, some of them are very different and seem to not even be correct, at least from the standpoint of Theravada. And so the Chinese version seems very rudimentary. I mean, one would have to really look at Japanese literature to get a handle on that. And I know that Asanga Guanxing at the University of Hong Kong he's done a lot of research on this. And but I actually don't see any real mention of the fact that there is this whole other half of the book that is so different in style too. Like, I'm sure you can attest to that. Once you get to that certain point, it's so different in style. And there's also many instances in the text where the text seems to like finish itself, and then it just keeps going on, and it says, okay, we're done now, and then it keeps going on. And I believe in the last part, the questions on metaphor, it says there's like, my numbers are not right, but there's 300 questions, and then they only give 266 or something. And so, I mean, it really was an ongoing project. And that's why you can imagine someone like Ashin Adichavamsa 1,500 years ago adding on another layer. Oftentimes, when people would add to the layer, it wouldn't just be the ending part was what you'd expect, but the beginning part is where a lot of additional material is put, especially in places like Thailand or maybe Myanmar or what have you. And so it's not just the end part, but the kind of Bahira Kata, the framing story, is the point where you can get a little bit more innovative, because the Nagasena Bhikshu Sutra, the beginning is so different. It starts with the story of the Elephant King kind of going to the forest and serving the Buddha. So I actually haven't seen that mentioned in any of the material, at least not the Nidana of the Abhidana of the dictionary, and I haven't yet seen Ashin Adichavamsa mention that. It might be too much of a problem to really kind of explain away, but I think that would be really fascinating to see if there's any of this kind of interaction. And I think Ashin Adichavamsa would be a really fruitful way to look at that, because of his familiarity with European scholarship, looking at the Chinese Bhikshu Sutra, the Nagasena Bhikshu Sutra. But in a long kind of roundabout way, I can't really answer that, as a matter of fact. The last thing I'll say, though, is there's a really interesting paper by Soto Mori coming out of Japan called the Milindapañha in the Pali Commentaries. Luckily, it's in English. And what's interesting is that a lot of the quotes that you see, so you'd expect Buddhaghosa just to quote from the first part, which is like the original Pali part, and to avoid the second part. But I believe most of his quotes actually come from the second kind of later part. And so the last thing I'll say, I've said that once before, but you see this interesting tradition in the Milinda Tika, and it seems as though the Mula Mingun Zedun Seda picks up on the same thing, that Buddhaghosa not only quoted the Milindapañha, but that he compiled it from disparate sources. So we see that in I think about 500 years ago in the Milinda Tika coming from Thailand, which was not really well known, if at all, in Myanmar. And then the Mula Mingun Zedun Seda is picking up on some of the similar ideas and saying, he actually says in the beginning, of his Milindapañha that it was compiled from disparate pieces by Buddhaghosa. So there is this seeming tradition in Pali scholarship that the Milindapañha was not written by Buddhaghosa, but he's the one who made the form that we have today. So wonderful question. I hope you can find some answers.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Anthony.
Thank you.
So are there any other questions? There's a... Tony, can you see the question? I think.
Yes. Okay, so I see Ashin Adichavamsa, another wonderful question, Adam, thank you so much. Ashin Adichavamsa seems to mostly be kind of like a lower Myanmar, hello Adam, thank you. Seems to be mostly like Yangon region, maybe a little bit more cosmopolitan. He spent a lot of his time overseas in India and in England, and so he seems to be kind of more of the metropolitan center. The Manlay Sayadaw, I don't know too much about him, and I mean he's another person where his work, and especially the discourse on the investigation of wisdom, looking at his different, he seems to be very widely traveled in the sense that he is having these debates with various monks. Then now the Mingun Jetavana, the Mula Mingun Jetavana, his headquarters were so you have in the Sagaing region, where he has, I think that's kind of where he started his meditation center and where his original base of support, and then going down to Taton and the Mon area and like Malyamine and stuff like that. Those seem to be his two bases of support. And I don't see him really going into any other parts of Myanmar, especially in the latter years. It seems the Mula Mingun Zedun spent most of his time in Taton Mon area, although he wrote the Milindapañha in the Sagaing region, and you can actually still see his the building where he wrote it. And so there's a little bit of back and forth in like his legacy, like who kind of controls it. And then I guess the real way I'll answer your questions, though, is that, I mean, this is obviously not true for scholars in Myanmar, but those of us who struggle to read Burmese, and it takes us a long time, I mean, I think so much work can be done on the interaction of all of these figures. And they certainly did form a network from what I can see. And they were aware of each other's work, and they were responding in a kind of, like we do as academics. So there is this academic monastic environment that they're all participating in. And that's why you see Ashin Adichavamsa and the Mula Mingun Zedun Sayadaw both picking up on these ideas in the Milindapañha to make some of these similar arguments. So I really need to do more work on that. Probably 10 years, 20 years, maybe I'll have a better sense. And if you have anything to share, but I think that's a really important question too. Thank you, Adam. And then I see. Yeah. Okay. Were there any monastic scholars that claimed that it was not possible in our days to become a Sotapanna? The way I look at it is that it seems like as though there are trends. So I'm not sure, and I'm not an expert on this, what I'm about to say. I'm not sure if this is about maybe 300 King Bodhapaya time, so longer than 200 years. But you do have that kind of the Aranyana kind of movement of so-called heretics that you see in some of the Burmese chronicles that said the exact opposite. That said that not only can you not become an arhat or a sotapanna or what have you, but that you can't even become, that even monkhood is not possible, let alone nuns. And so you do see certain trends, and I'm not saying it's cyclical, but it's certainly not like it was quiet and you couldn't become an arhat and then all of a sudden it popped up. But it seems as though there were points where people were saying absolutely not, and then people were saying yes, you can. Again, it all kind of depends on how you interpret the commentaries, and that's why Ashin Adichavamsa's work is so important, because you can really the commentaries, and then if you add the sub commentaries onto that, they're really quite, either they're not definitive or they can be contradictory. And that's where the Milindapañha comes into play, because there's kind of like, hey, there's contradictions here. How do you deal with these contradictions? And so there's enough material out there that's somewhat authoritative where people can make arguments one way or the other. There is Daniel Stewart, who writes about Vipassana and especially Goenka in Hindi, but I mean, he's at the University of North Carolina. He has some really interesting views. I think there's some interesting connections between like the Seaji Uba Kin lineage and what we see in the Mula Mingun Vipassana lineage. And so more connections between that, I think, would be really interesting to see how there are these ideas of like Vipassana having this kind of second wave. Vipassana creating a new era within the Buddhist sasana, a little window where people can become enlightened. And so, even though the Ledi lineage and the Mingun lineage, Mahasi lineage are quite separate at the moment, they seem to share some of these same narratives. But I can't think of any people that say it's not possible. I doubt that you would get like a real hard and fast on that, but I think you would have someone like the Nyangyan Sayadaw, maybe more scholarly monks, and I don't want to stereotype this, who are saying, well, maybe it's possible, but it's much, much, much more difficult than other people would admit associated with the Vipassana community. And you have Lance Cousins has an interesting article, I can't remember actually the name of it, but where he talks about some instances in the 60s where I think in the Mahasi lineage, where like young men were like quickly rushed and ordained as monks because they were have thought to have reached a certain stage, and other people were saying, oh, it's happening much too easy. And Seiji Uba Kin actually wrote an a little piece where he was defending how easy it was to become enlightened according to his view. And so there certainly were attacks of certain groups, probably monastic, like entrenched monastic hierarchies, that said, we're not necessarily saying it's impossible, but it's nowhere near as easy as it's being made out to be by some of these other people. Now, the question is whether women can become ordained or not. I think that is a stickier question. And I do know that the Mula Mingun Zedun Sayadaw certainly thought that was the case, and it seems Ashin Adichavamsa as well. But that's a wonderful question, and a lot more work needs to be done on that as well.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you for your, such a wonderful answers. So I would like to invite Kate, and now.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk to finish the series on. Tony, very rich in all sorts of ways, textually, historically, sort of a nice post-colonial twist for us as well. Lots of very, very rich material. So thank you very much for finishing our series. And could I also just thank Pijo, Olivia Porter, and if she's there, Angela Chu, for organising this series. It's been really wonderful, and started right at the back, right early on, before there were so many online seminars available. And so for me, it was particularly helpful to have that community. So thank you everybody who's sustained us over this time, and we'll be back in touch for whatever we're planning to do during the rainy season as well. Thank you very much, and also a little hello to a fellow founder of the Transnational Network of Theravada Studies, Sven Bretfeld, who's joined us today as well. Thank you everyone. We'll stop recording now, and those who want to stay for a chat can do so, and if not, farewell and